Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are doing another in our Listen and Learn series talking about the UCC Rule 2207. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Hi, and welcome back to the Listen and Learn series from the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. We've been getting some great feedback from you, our listeners, so thanks for that. In particular, one bar student messaged us recently asking us to cover a UCC topic. Great idea! So today we're going to be tackling UCC 2207, or Battle of the Forms, as it's commonly called. We chose this topic because it can be confusing and it's fair game on the bar. So let's jump in. First things first, whenever you write a contracts essay, you want to make sure that you start off by stating which law applies. A header that says applicable law is almost always the first thing a grader wants to see on the page. Remember that the UCC, or the Uniform Commercial Code, applies whenever the agreement has to do with a sale of goods. Normally on the bar, it will be clear whether you're dealing with goods or not. Goods are things that are movable and tangible at the time the contract is made. So, jars of spaghetti sauce, widgets, crops, and livestock are all goods. It's pretty rare that the bar examiners make a huge issue over whether something is a good or not. But when in doubt, the predominant purpose test applies. What does that mean? Whatever the main central point of the contract is will decide whether the contract is governed by the goods rules, the UCC, or under the regular old common law. So, for example, if a homeowner ordered a bunch of wood from a carpenter so the carpenter could build them a fence, that agreement involves both the goods, the lumber, and the service, the work to build the fence, right? So it might not be totally clear whether we are dealing with a UCC goods type of contract or the regular common law. However, what you would need to do is ask yourself what, at the end of the day, the predominant purpose of the contract was. Was the homeowner's goal to just get a big random pile of wood in his yard? No, the main purpose of the contract was not just to buy wood. It was to pay the carpenter for the skill and labor it takes to turn that wood into a fence. So the main point was actually a service, building a fence. That means that the common law and not the UCC applies. Make sense? Okay, now back to the UCC in Section 2207 in particular. To understand this rule, it's important to know a tiny bit of background first. Remember the mirror image rule from the common law? That's the rule that says that the acceptance has to mirror the offer. If the acceptance comes back and adds terms or changes anything, then it's not going to work and the contract does not get formed. Now imagine two merchants. They have their standard boilerplate contracts that no one ever reads. I mean, seriously, nobody ever reads them. The offeror sends a request for 2 tons of steel and includes a blurb about terms and conditions and a foreign selection clause. The offeree thinks the 2 tons of steel idea sounds great and agrees. But that offeree has an arbitration clause in its fine print, and it doesn't match with the fine print from the offer. So what happens under the old mirror image rule? Well, the agreement fails. Uh-oh. So you can see how this would be super frustrating for 2 merchants who probably aren't going to read all the boilerplate language and just want to buy and sell their steel in peace. Enter UCC 2207, the mirror image eraser. So the main idea is to remember when it comes to the UCC 2207 is that this rule came in to change the common law mirror image rule and say that the acceptance does not have to exactly match the offer. Okay, with me so far? Now let's get down to the basics of how the rule works. The rule is that where there is a definite and seasonable expression of acceptance with additional terms, that expression will operate as an acceptance. Now let's unpack that for a minute. Definite means terms aren't left up in the air. If the buyer wants steel but doesn't know how many tons, that's not definite enough. Or if he says he wants metal but doesn't specify what kind, that's not going to work either. Definite means there's nothing waiting to be decided. Both people know what is being bought and sold and for how much. Seasonable, what does that mean? It means within the right time frame. These aren't rule elements that typically make or break your analysis. Now, what about the idea of additional terms? That's just what it sounds like. When the acceptance comes back with stuff added that was not in the original offer. So what that rule I just stated means is that if the acceptance comes back and it looks totally normal, but happens to add something extra, it's not going to automatically defeat the agreement. The contract doesn't get thrown out like it would under the old mirror image rule. Okay, so what happens with those additional terms? The acceptance says new stuff. So what does the offeror do with that information? Well, the second part of the rule deals with that. The rule says that whether the additional terms will become part of the contract depends on whether the contract is between two merchants. If both the offeror and the offeree are merchants, then the additional terms will be part of the contract. Makes sense, right? Merchants buy and sell things for a living. They are presumably savvy and efficient in a way that normal people may not be. All right, so we have two merchants. Are the additional terms always going to become part of the contract? No. There are 3 exceptions. The rule to remember is that when it comes to two merchants, any additional terms will become part of the contract unless, number 1, they materially alter the contract, number 2, the offeror objects within a reasonable time, or 3, the offer expressly limits acceptance to the terms of the contract. So what does all that mean? Well, basically, unless the new term throws everything off, the other guy says no, or the offer itself says, hey, don't add anything, the new term will get into the contract. Makes sense, right? Now what happens if one or both people are not merchants? Well, the rule in that situation is different. If the acceptance comes back with additional terms, acceptance still works, but that new term will be treated as a proposal for an addition to the contract. That means the other party can accept or reject it. And finally, sometimes you'll see a situation where the offer will say something like, acceptance is expressly conditioned on the assent to additional terms. That's the scenario from exception 3 that I just mentioned. In that case, the acceptance will be treated as a counteroffer. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to get a basic understanding of these rules. But let's walk through a couple of quick hypos just to make sure. Here is the first fact pattern. Rod likes to restore vintage cars and has been working on one particular old coupe with flames on the side. He finally finishes it and drives it down to the grocery store. While he is shopping, Richie walks by and sees the car and falls in love. He sticks a note under the windshield wiper that reads, I would like to buy your car for $100,000. If you agree, please come by my house on December 20th and lists the home address. Rod finds the note and thinks it's a great deal and plans to sell the car to Richie. However, he's already promised to drive the flame-sided coupe in the New Year's Eve parade in town. He mails a letter to Richie, which Richie receives on December 15th, just in time, that says, I would like to sell you the coupe for $100,000 if you loan it to me on New Year's Eve so I can drive it in the parade. Do Rod and Richie have a contract? And if so, what are the terms? Well, first things first, are we dealing with goods or something else? Is a car a tangible, movable item? Well, yeah, it is. So no question about that. So the applicable law is the UCC. Next question. Was there an offer? Yes. Richie put it in the note on the windshield offering to buy the car for $100,000. Pretty slam dunk issue there. What about acceptance? The offer said to come to Richie's house and instead Rod mailed a letter. So the terms of the offer don't quite match the terms of the purported acceptance. Do the offer and acceptance have to be mirror images of each other under the UCC? Nope. So this part is fine. Now that we see the offer and acceptance don't match, we can look into UCC 2207. So first question, are we dealing with two merchants? Well, Rod likes to restore cars, but this sounds like a hobby. There is nothing in the facts to tell us that this is his job. What about Richie? We have no information on him except that he goes around grocery store parking lots falling in love with other people's cars. Does that make him a merchant? Without more facts? No. So 2 non-merchant parties. What happens next? The rule is that when one or both parties are non-merchants, any deviation from the offer will be treated as a proposal for addition to the contract. Now, what does that mean for these guys? Well, when Richie gets that letter, he can decide whether he wants to buy the car and then loan it back to Rod for one day so he can drive it in the parade. On an essay, what you would want to do is state the possible outcomes and then conclude in a reasonable way one way or another. See if you can use some facts to show why you're concluding the way you are. That will get you more points. For example, you could say something like, since New Year's is just one day and a single parade would not add a lot of mileage to the car, Richie would probably accept the additional term. Assuming he did, acceptance is satisfied and Rod's new term would become part of the contract. Pretty straightforward so far, right? Now let's do one more hypo so you can practice. This one is a bit more complicated. Ready? Here we go. Tutu is a ballet clothing company that needs to make some new leotards. Tutu orders the pink fabric from Fabby's Fabrics. Tutu sends a boilerplate form that requests fabric and contains a clause at the end that says, Tutu reserves the right to return any fabric within 60 days of purchase for any reason. Fabby's replies with their own boilerplate form accepting the offer, but the fine print at the bottom of the form states no returns for any reason. Did the parties form a contract? And if so, what are the terms? Well, first things first. Is fabric a good? Is it tangible? Yes. Movable? Yes. Definitely a good. Next step, are the parties merchants? Well, Tutu makes ballet clothes and Fabby sells fabric. So yes, there's no doubt about it. We are dealing with 2 merchants. Was there an offer? Yes. Tutu asked for pink fabric. Was there an acceptance? Looks like it. Fabby's replied back and said yes. So what's the problem? The 2 forms don't match. The offer says Tutu can return items, and the purported acceptance says they can't. So what happens next? Under UCC 2207, the difference in terms would not be a deal breaker because no mirror image is required. Because we're dealing with 2 merchants, the general rule tells us that the new term will be part of the contract so long as it doesn't 1. Materially alter the contract, 2. The other party objects, or 3. The offer expressly limits acceptance to the terms laid out in the offer. Now, did we have any of those exceptions here? Well, we don't have facts about Tutu objecting or limiting terms to the acceptance, so you'd need to look at whether the new term materially alters the contract. You could argue either way about that. Now, something about this might be bugging you. Is the new term an additional term? Not really, right? It's sort of a contradiction to an existing term. One form says yes to returns, the other form says no. So what do we do in this situation? Well, surprise, surprise, courts differ on this. Some courts say that UCC 2207 is about additional terms, not different terms. So because the change in the return policy was not adding something, it was actually changing something, that new term in the acceptance would fall away and the contract would be formed on the original language from the offer about the 60-day return policy. Other courts treat additional or different terms the same way regardless of whether they just add something or change it. This is where you'd want to look at the 3 exceptions mentioned above to get into analyzing whether any applied, like materiality of the return policy. Finally, some other courts follow a third approach where the different terms will knock out each other. This is why you might hear UCC 2207 referred to as the knockout rule. Under this approach, the 2 terms cancel each other out, and the missing information is filled in by something like trade usage in the industry or a gap filler term. Remember, we are dealing with 2 merchants, so that the information shouldn't be too hard for the court to find. On a bar essay, the important thing to do is use each and every fact you are given and walk your way through the steps. As I was explaining the rule earlier, you may have found it tricky to visualize. Totally understandable. This is why I always encourage students to write this one out by hand as a flowchart. It's a lot easier to conceptualize this way. And on your exam, remember that UCC 2207 comes up as a subpart to acceptance. That means you still need to talk about whether or not there was an offer first. And then afterwards, make sure you don't skip discussing whether there was consideration. And with that, we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or alison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.